from an aircraft with only the thinnest film of nylon to break the fall requires unique courage. The airborne soldier must not only overcome the unnatural act of the jump, but also be prepared to fight once on the ground. Fort Benning, Georgia. These young men and women have just completed jump school at the U.S. Army's 82nd Airborne Division. They are proud to wear the wings of the paratrooper and join an intensely proud fraternity of individuals. Being airborne cuts across national lines. They feel a comradeship with the airborne of many nations. There hasn't been a strategically significant parachute assault for more than half a century. Yet the very name airborne still evokes awe in the military world, and for good reason. Airborne designated soldiers are the best trained forces available to any army. The essence of their training makes them the best. It is very intensive and demanding, both physically and psychologically. Paratroops must learn split-second timing. Teamwork is critical. The physical act of dropping hundreds of feet through the sky and then fighting an enemy demands stamina. Because airborne forces are designed to operate independently behind enemy lines, the individuals must learn to be resilient and self-reliant. There are no long logistical trains of support for the airborne forces. Airborne forces know they are among the best. They have great esprit de corps. This alone gives them an edge in battle that few other combat forces can draw upon. For these reasons, it is the airborne forces that are usually first to deploy when the threat or reality of combat is present. The airborne forces of the world all share this common bond. Their aim in life is to place themselves in harm's way, and they do this without hesitation. Part of their fierce pride derives from the proud and bloody history of airborne forces. Even adversaries have a respect for one another. It was certainly not always this way. In the beginning, few officers in the British, French, or American armies took the concept seriously. The first recorded parachute drop was made in February 1912 by one Albert Berry, who jumped at an American army base. No one took particular note of the occasion. Shortly thereafter, the Great War ensued. Military planners in Europe concentrated their efforts in the great slaughter of trench warfare. The modern parachute did evolve in the war. Army balloonists were able to parachute back to Earth if in danger, but initially, the Royal Flying Corps didn't issue parachutes to their pilots, lest any be tempted to literally drop out of a fight with the Germans. Yet the idea of airborne forces had taken root. The French, Italians, and Russians all dropped small teams behind enemy lines. An American colonel, Billy Mitchell, later to earn the wrath of his superiors because of his support of aviation, did suggest a mass drop on the German garrison at Metz in 1918. His suggestion would be prophetic. The war ended before the concept could be tested. The immediate post-war years in Europe were hard for Germany and Russia for different reasons. Germany had been defeated and was under the terms of the Versailles Treaty. Russia had undergone a chaotic revolution leading to a communist government. New solutions to old problems on many fronts were necessary in both countries. The Soviets had the problem of trying to build a new empire. Civil war raged in Russia until Lenin gained near total control. The army the communists inherited from old Imperial Russia was old-fashioned and inflexible. The Soviet Union was a huge country, and utilizing airborne units was a logical military move. German military observers were particularly impressed by a Soviet exercise in 1931. The paras themselves crouched like stuntmen on the airplane wings, being dragged clear by the slipstream after pulling their ripcords. Still, it was a method of delivering many men and specially designed air mobile supplies across a long distance quickly. The Soviets eventually were able to conduct 1,000-man drops. This was a tactic that would not be ignored. The Soviets turned to airborne forces out of necessity. The new leaders in Russia recognized their own backwardness and saw the necessity to take radical action militarily to be able to catch up with the West in terms of pure armed force. One of the new strategies adopted was the theory of deep battle. This envisioned small groups of men deployed by parachute far behind enemy lines in order to cause chaos and pave the way for the main body of troops to arrive by glider or transport aircraft. German advisors helped the Soviets and developed even more sophisticated airborne practices. With the Nazi takeover in Germany, aviation became a focal point of rearmament. The Nazis started a youth program to develop flyers of the future. A cadre of young pilots emerged capable of handling the aircraft that could easily be converted from civilian to military applications. September 1939, Blitzkrieg. German forces moved rapidly to conquer Poland. No German airborne forces would parachute in these early battles. They were hardly needed in any event. But Hitler was still bluffing. He could not handle an aggressive move by the Allies in the West. The race was on to determine who would strike first on the Western Front. The Allies moved into Norway to be ahead of the Germans. They were too late. Hitler moved more decisively using his new airborne forces. Although outnumbered 5-1, the Germans outmaneuvered the British, French, and Norwegians. The Nazis only jumped on selective targets, such as airports, but this was enough to capture the initiative. They were followed by German air mobile forces, which poured onto the seized airfields, followed by German fighters and bombers. These tightly coordinated actions would prove to become classic airborne techniques. The battlefield was extended. German air units harassed British and French moves to reinforce Norway. The Allies had not learned to deal with the fast-paced German air operations. With Scandinavia secured, Hitler could look west against the main bulk of British and French forces. The German airborne troops would again play a critical role. The Dutch thought they were protected by their neutrality, the French their Maginot Line. The British felt their army was better than the Germans, and the Belgians had their string of frontier forts and their fortified strong point at Airborne at the junction of the Albert Canal and the Meuse River. The German plan was simple. Regular Wehrmacht troops would invade Holland to draw Allied forces north. Meanwhile, German panzers would break through the Ardennes to the south in a great pincer move that would trap the British and French. The fortress at Airborne stood in the middle and would have to be taken quickly. Again, the highly developed German airborne tactics would come into play. On the dawn of May 10th, 55 German paratroopers, carried aboard gliders, landed on the roof of the seemingly impregnable fortress. The 700 Belgian troops inside were trapped. The Germans had trained extensively for this exercise. Each man knew what was expected of him. Sappers raced among the gun emplacements to place explosive charges. Flamethrowers were brought up against others. Stukas dive-bombed the fortress, causing more damage and sowing confusion. Again, coordinated attacks proved the worth of airborne forces. German reinforcements attacked the perimeter of the fortress. The Belgians were being assaulted from within and without. Other paras attacked bridges in the vicinity. The fighting was bitter. Individual Belgians resisted valiantly, and the Germans were still thin on the ground. A determined, well-planned counterattack would have succeeded, but none came. Within 2 days, the battle was won by the Germans. The Nazi offensive against the Dutch utilized conventional forces moving across the frontier, but the main attack came from the air. Leaving the Dutch army behind in defensive positions, the German paratroops, who had practiced and trained for years, now would show the world what airborne forces were truly capable of in battle. Over 10,000 paras from 2 German airborne divisions would drop. port of Rotterdam was a main target. The airport and outlying sections of the city were quickly taken. Dutch resistance was strong, but the element of surprise was in favor of the Germans. Their ground forces now raced across the Dutch countryside to make contact with the paratroops. Holland was doomed. The German paratroops seemed unstoppable. Across the Channel, Britain prepared for an airborne assault. Winston Churchill, who had become Prime Minister as the assault on Airborne was taking place, was quickly learning. He ordered a British airborne force created. Early in 1940, John Roth of the Royal Engineers was detailed to take charge of the fledgling organization. And that was about the extent of his brief. With no policy or task to guide him, Major Roth and his Air Force colleagues under Wing Commander Morris Newman set about training volunteers from No. 2 Commando at the newly created landing establishment at Ringway, today the site of Manchester Airport. Although Churchill's orders gave the new force the impetus it needed, resources were in short supply. They had no parachutes, and the hard-pressed RAF could only spare 3 aging Whitley bombers. The whole operation was one of trial and error. Jumping techniques were refined to enable the paratrooper to have his chute deploy automatically with the aid of a static line as he jumped through a hole in the fuselage of the aircraft. This was a strip of canvas attached to the ripcord on the inside of the aircraft. It proved to be safer. It deployed the canopy automatically as the paratrooper left the aircraft rather than have a dispatcher pull the ripcord. It was to remain the standard technique for many years after the war. Jumping through a hole in the floor was not without its risks.
If you weren't careful, you caught the parachute pack on the side of the aperture, which tilted you forward. You bashed your nose on the other side, and it was called ringing the bell. So there were a lot of people about, budding parachutists, with injuries to their noses.
The type of clothing worn by the paratrooper also changed. To begin with, the paratroopers wore a bulky padded oversuit, copied from the Germans. It was soon realized that this was an impractical item of clothing once the paratroop soldier was fighting on the ground, and so the distinctive smock was developed. This was worn over the standard combat uniform and is still worn today. The paratrooper's head was protected by a helmet made of cork and rubber until replaced by a steel helmet. British paratroopers jumped without a reserve chute, and the preferred jumping altitude was approximately 500 feet. This meant that the paratrooper was only in the air and at his most vulnerable for some 7 seconds. The combination of training and parachuting was enough to weed out unsuitable volunteers. Soon the airborne forces began to attract a special kind of soldier.
The standard of the soldiers. This business of having to jump out of an aircraft provided an automatic selection procedure. If he was prepared to do that, then surely he then had the potential to be a really good soldier. And nice people too, and a delight to command later on. Now I was fascinated with this fact that this one act of parachuting, or perhaps qualifying after 7 or 8 jumps, was enough to select out or to knock out those who were unlikely to make good soldiers.
By November of 1940, 500 men had qualified as military parachutists. No. 2 Commando had become 11 SAS Battalion. It was now time to mount a combat mission. The entire battalion volunteered for the 38 places available on the specially formed X Troop. The objective of Operation Colossus was to destroy the Trigino Aqueduct in southern Italy.
I think the main aim of the Trigino raid was, although we thought at the time it was to stop the water supply to the Italian bases in the south of Italy, but in practice it was really about discovering whether we were competent or clever enough to mount a parachute raid at all. And we'd flown out from England, landed in Malta, and from there took off and landed about 4 or 5 hours later, as far as I remember, in the mountains of southern Italy. And then, soon after we landed, within about 3 or 4 hours, we blew up the aqueduct. But unfortunately, all of us were then taken prisoner.
Dean Drummond, seen here in a picture taken by the Red Cross after his capture, had no intention of spending the rest of the war as a prisoner. Eventually, he made it back to England after escaping a second time, disguised as an electrician. His unwillingness to be defeated would serve him well later in the war. As fate would have it, at the time the British were mounting their first experimental operation, the Germans were preparing for the most dramatic airborne assault of the war, the capture of Crete. British forces had withdrawn to the island after their defeat at the hands of the Germans in Greece. RAF bombers could still strike at Nazi targets throughout the eastern Mediterranean from Crete's airfields. While the Germans were weak in amphibious capability, their airborne was more than proven by this point in the war. Hitler approved a plan to conquer Crete by air, a move designed to quickly remove a major roadblock on the road to mastery of the entire Middle East. It would prove to be a prize with a severe price. Troops landed by parachute, glider, and air transport, all on one single day. The Germans were actually outnumbered by Commonwealth troops, but they did have the advantage to surprise. The blazing sunshine and heat was nearly as deadly as was the British defense. The attack was not smooth, and the Germans faced chaos from the moment they landed. The British put up a heroic fight, but the Germans and Italians controlled the air. The defenders were ultimately doomed, and the British had to endure yet one more withdrawal, so they could fight yet another day. The Germans paid for victory with blood, with more than 3,000 men dead and as many wounded in the olive groves and scorched landscape of Crete. Such attrition was unacceptable to Hitler. He said that he believed the days of large airborne assaults were finished and vowed not to undertake another one because the element of surprise had gone out of the shock of using parachute forces. He did not realize that Crete was a great airborne victory in spite of the relatively high casualties. The Americans were shocked by what they considered the success of the Crete operation. They had just taken the first tentative steps towards creating an airborne force when the Germans showed how powerful massed airborne assaults could be. The Americans studied captured German combat films closely. They realized there were many lessons to be learned from what the Germans had perfected to a better extent than any other military at the moment. They would apply these techniques at Fort Benning, Georgia, where, in 1940, a small test platoon had been established. These men, like the British, had no firm guidance on how to establish a parachute army. Every technique and rough training procedure had to be created from scratch.
So that started off, we had 48 men and 2 officers to form a test platoon. We didn't know anything about it, they didn't know anything about it. Nobody had ever ridden an aircraft, seen a parachute jump or ridden an aircraft when we went and started jumping. Didn't have no big aircraft, they had to bring some in. Had a little bitty observation ship flying around, and 2 guys peeping out over you.
Equipment was improvised. The men wore off-the-shelf old-style American football helmets for protection. Unlike their British cousins, the Americans got to carry reserve chutes when they trained. America was not yet at war, and losing young men in airborne training was not what the infant service needed. The Americans also differed from the British in using high towers for initial drops rather than from static balloons. Still, the effect on the men was the same. If they could handle these drops, along with the other rugged training, then they were more likely to make it as regular paratroopers. The recruits considered themselves special.
From the first day I got to Fort Benning, which was the training ground of the Airborne, I never had cause to doubt that the Airborne was 100%, because those guys are rough and tough and hard to bluff, you know. And anytime you didn't like the looks of somebody's face, you were free to try to change it. And, you know, nobody would hold it against you either. You just, you were your own man, and you could go as far as you wanted to go and do the things you wanted to do.
The test platoon was successful enough for the Americans in September of 1940 to order the establishment of their first regular airborne unit, the 501st Parachute Infantry Battalion. America might not have been fully ready to go to war, but she did have a cadre of trained men willing to go. The American para's famous jump cry was adopted in these early days after one trooper was told he would be too afraid to remember his own name when making his first jump. He instead shouted the name of an Indian hero in a film popular at the time, Geronimo. The paratroopers alone could not make an effective airborne assault. They would need supplies, reinforcements, and heavy weapons. In the early 1940s, these could only be provided by the flimsy glider. The men of the glider forces were the unsung heroes of airborne operations. In these early days, the Americans didn't even give glider pilots the right to wear wings on their uniforms. The bulky and awkward British horses and American Wacos would supply the backup for the paratroops. The gliders were towed aloft typically by bombers or by C-47 Dakotas. In optimum conditions, they were released a few hundred feet from their landing zone and plunged, literally in controlled crashes, to the ground. The pilots had very little maneuvering ability, and one problem was finding enough open space to land. The urgencies of war meant some gliders were built by casket builders. Inevitably, gliders earned the nickname flying coffins.
Flying gliders was just as difficult in training as it was in combat, and we lost I don't suppose as many glider pilots in training as we did in combat, but we came close to it. And the American Air Corps of that time, later became the Air Force, had really uncut diamonds in these men that were able to fly gliders. And I don't believe that they ever really perceived what they had. A lot of the glider pilots were men who had learned to fly in small country airports. And when the war came along, they had this ability to fly and training, and they wanted to use that ability. And they wanted to fly. But the Air Force of that day had stipulations in which you had to be a certain age, you had to have certain physical qualifications, and in many cases also educational qualifications. And a lot of the glider pilots were not able to pass those. For example, if you were past 25 in age, they didn't want you to go into flying. They wanted you to do something else. So a lot of these men were in their 30s and wanted to do something for their country, so they volunteered to fly gliders. It was the only opening in any type of flying that they were able to do. So they gave them that choice, and they took it.
The luckiest pilots would be the first on the ground. Those in later formations found the landing zones crowded. Balance was critical. Since they were often loaded with heavy equipment in the rear, landing gliders could easily nose over, bringing instant death to those inside from the cargo ripped free from its restraints. In addition to equipment, the gliders also carried infantry. It was a tough way to go to war. Pearl Harbor meant the United States would now join the global conflict. The small American Airborne Corps were greatly expanded. By July 1942, 2 airborne divisions had been organized, the 82nd and the 101st. Both generals and enlisted men quickly had to change their approach to war, and infantrymen became airborne troops. Meanwhile, in Britain, the newly formed Parachute Brigade prepared for further action. In February 1942, the recently formed C Company of the 2nd Battalion took off from their Whitley bombers and set course for the French coast. In perfect weather, they jumped over their target, Bruneval near Le Havre. The objective of Operation Biting was to capture radar equipment in a villa that the Germans had started to use to great effect against the Allied bombers. The force of nearly 200 men was divided into 5 groups, named after great British naval heroes: Nelson, Hardy, Jellicoe, Drake, and Rodney. They were accompanied by a radar expert from the RAF, who had never made an airplane flight before, much less a drop by parachute. Each group had a different objective. On clearing the drop zone, the Drake group was to capture the villa and dismantle the radar equipment. This they achieved with complete surprise. Meanwhile, the Rodney group had been detailed to contain a German unit billeted in a wood some 400 yards away. At first, the German response was slow, and the radar was almost dismantled before effective fire was returned. As the British withdrew to the beach where they were to be picked up by landing craft, they came under increasing heavy fire. It was at this critical stage that the Nelson group would be dropped some 2 miles short of the target, arrive, and with great dash, subdue the enemy strongpoints. Under an intense enemy barrage, the groups boarded the landing craft and met up with ships to take them back to England. The whole raid was a complete success, with almost the complete radar system being captured along with 2 operators. The next operation came 9 months later. It was to be Britain's first glider operation. The operation, codenamed Freshman, was to be an assault on a heavy water production plant in Norway. The Allies were worried at this stage in the war that the Germans were making inroads towards making atomic weapons. Heavy water was a vital component to a nuclear weapons program. 3 gliders, containing 17 men each, took off with their tugs in Scotland. Only one of the tug aircraft returned. It was only after the war that the fate of the rest of the force became known. All had been murdered by the Gestapo. Trujillo, Bruneval, and Norway were all daring and unorthodox examples of the use of airborne troops. And if Bruneval was the only true successful operation, the new air arm had been given something to sharpen its claws on. In August of 1942, the Parachute Regiment was formed as part of the Army Air Corps and given its now legendary insignia, the Blue Wings. The emblem of the airborne forces, Bellerophon, astride Pegasus, was worn by all ranks. The regiment and airborne forces in general was rapidly earning a reputation as an elite corps. Recruits were volunteers from other regiments.
By the time the Airborne came into existence in the 1942, the proper Airborne, when they started forming divisions, they were regarded as one of the elite units of the British Army, and along with the commandos and the Marine commandos, I always reckon that if you're going to fight a war, then you may as well be in the elite and fight with one that going to be one of the best units, and one that believed it was as good as any unit it was likely to come up against. And I think your chances of survival, although we had a dodgy way of going into battle, perhaps in gliders or by parachute, once you got into battle, your chances of survival in many ways were probably better than a lot of the infantry. So yeah, I had no qualms about going into the Airborne. In fact, I was sort of eager to get there, and I got in the end of 42 when I was 17 and a half, 18 years. I think I was short of my 18th birthday then.
The Airborne appealed to those who wanted to fly, even if they couldn't be pilots. For one recruit, failing one eye test only made him more determined to pass a second.
They said, well, how would you like to become a parachutist? And I hadn't thought about this before. And I said, well, why not? I'll have a go. If I can't be a glider pilot, I'll be a parachutist. So 6 weeks later, I was sent to the Airborne Forces Depot at Hardwick Hall in Derbyshire. And there we had to have a medical examination to check that we were fit to be parachutists. And I thought, well, this time I'm not going to fail on the ISET. But these tests were not quite as individual as the aircrew medical examination had been. And such that we queued up for the various examinations, and one of these was to read the eye test in chart. And I thought, well, if I'm not careful, I'll be failing again, so I put my glasses on, and by an incredible feat of memory, I don't know how I did it, I memorised the eye chart from top to bottom. Joined the queue without my glasses on, and when my turn came, I read it perfectly. It was assumed that I had perfect eyesight, so I passed the medical with flying colours. So that was how I got into the parachute regiment.
Harwick Hall in Derbyshire became the office depot and first stop for volunteers. The training program was extremely tough in order to weed out unsuitable candidates. The course was designed to instill an offensive spirit, as they would often be dropped into action lightly armed and facing greater numbers. It was this motivation that had seen the paratrooper overcome seemingly overpowering odds through the regiment's history.
The place you went in, Harwick Hall, we got out to Chesterfield railway station, and there was a company, a platoon of French Foreign Legionnaires, all marching off steady. The outside was a truck, so we slung all our kit in the trucks. We were about to leap into them when a horrible sergeant says, "Where do you think you're going?" "You're marching back." Because these legionnaires are all in step where we come from different units. Well, anyway, we marched to Harwick Hall barracks, and there's two gates, a north and south. And once you got in there, for that fortnight, you wasn't allowed out, off duty. So consequence being, you allocate the huts, and then you running. I saw every morning you go out to PT. They used to have exercises where one platoon would go to one gate, one out the other, and when you meet, the instructors would say, set upon each other, want to see a bit of blood, and then they blow a whistle, and you go past each other, and you come back in the opposite gates.
The next operation was to see the regiment perform in its classic role, landing ahead of and cooperating with ground forces. America had recently entered the war, and the parachute regiment was an immediate beneficiary due to increased numbers of C-47 Dakota aircraft being flown directly from the States. The Dakota was a major improvement over the Whitley, as the paratroopers could leave like gentlemen, through the door. Since 1941, the British had been fighting a seesaw battle for North Africa against Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps. It had been a battle largely dominated by massed armored units, with airborne units playing no significant role. After the victory of General Montgomery at El Alamein, the tide began to turn. It would be the infusion of American forces, who had been quickly trained in the US, that would allow the final push to victory. The men were anxious to join the battle. In November 1942, combined Allied forces invaded Vichy French North Africa. It would be the Americans, first moving against the Germans. The Yanks' inexperience in warfare would result in tragic mistakes. The first American airborne troops would fly all the way from England to Algeria. They would be in for a surprise.
Everybody was gung-ho. Everybody was ready to go. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. We figured that we could take on the whole damn German army, and of course, at the beginning, it wasn't the German army we were taking on, it was the French. Our first casualties came from the French. And that was kind of a shock to most people. Because before we took off, you know, they had two plans, the war plan and the peace plan. And it all depended, you know, on what was what. We were going to jump at night if it was a war plan, and we were going to jump in the daylight if it was a peace plan. And this was November 8th, 1942. Well, we got the signal it was going to be the peace plan. And we were in for a rude shock, because it was sure as hell not the peace plan. It was the war plan. Because the French fired on us and shot down 3 planes.
It was not a glorious beginning of the war for the American paratroopers, but ultimately they would prevail. The American and British airborne forces were beginning to work together. Cooperation would be critical for coordinated operations in the future. Each had much to contribute to the other.
So we trained very vigorously
with the 1st Airborne Brigade, British. And those guys, they saved many lives on our account. I'll clue you. They were great, absolutely great. And the upshot was, you know, we taught them how to jump out of C-47 planes, and they taught us how to survive in combat.
The Allies urgently needed to rid Africa of the Germans. With Rommel's Africa Corps defeated, the way would be open for the Allies to attack the German southern flank through Sicily and Italy. This would open the long-awaited Second Front and relieve pressure on the besieged Russians. The attack was pressed. The British Airborne deployed in the early stages of the campaign. The 3rd Parachute Battalion jumped into the vital airfield of Beaune, between Algiers and Tunis. Coincidentally, just as the British were jumping, a German airborne unit was en route to the same airfield and had to turn back upon learning the British were already there. The British 1st Battalion achieved a similar success at Souk El Aba, occupying a key road junction at only 90 miles from Tunis. The 2nd Battalion was less fortunate. They were dropped with the objective of destroying an enemy airfield and German equipment on the ground. However, the aerodrome was abandoned. This, coupled with the fact that the 1st Army advance had been held up, meant that the 2nd Battalion was now 50 miles behind enemy lines. Their fighting withdrawal back to Allied lines had all the epic qualities that were to be the hallmarks of the Parachute Regiment's exploits from Bruneval to Arnhem. Lightly equipped and short of ammunition, they arrived back to relative safety, having lost 16 officers and 250 men. Throughout the North Africa campaign, the 1st Parachute Brigade fought more battles than any other formation in the 1st Army, often fighting as infantry. They took 3,500 prisoners and inflicted over 5,000 casualties, at a cost of 1,700 to themselves. Not only did they earn the respect of their army comrades, but also that of the enemy, who christened them Roter Teufels, the Red Devils. The name was taken as a compliment and adopted by all the British airborne forces. At the same time, a Tunisian shepherd corps, Ro Mohammed, became the battle cry of the 1st Brigade, and later of all British airborne forces.
They used to say, "Ro Mohammed," and we used to do that. We'd come out these pubs and find that we were being waylaid by a huge, great gang, sometimes American. We used to shout at the top of our voice, "Ro Mohammed!" And airborne guys, they used to leave their girlfriends, whatever they were doing, leave other pubs. And it was a job to find a pub with beer in sometimes. They'd leave and they'd all come piling in. And these they never got onto it, the Americans. I never understood why they never figured it out, didn't have their own battle cry, because we used to let up this battle cry, and airborne guys had come from everywhere, and suddenly they'd find themselves swamped by airborne. And of course we used to have battle royals, and it used to go on for hours sometimes. We'd have the MPs, they'd leave us alone. They wouldn't even sort of risk getting involved because the airborne were in there. But that was esprit de corps, you know. I mean, one guy only had to shout "Waho Mohammed" in Salisbury, and any airborne man that heard it went straight in. Didn't matter who he was from, what unity, whether he was glider, para, who he was a red berry and he was in trouble, and you went in. And that was the airborne, I think, esprit de corps.
By May, Field Marshal Montgomery could celebrate the virtual collapse of German resistance in North Africa. There would only be a few short weeks before Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily, would begin. On paper, taking Sicily seemed easy. There were 10 Allied divisions poised to take on 2 understrength German divisions and elements of 4 demoralized Italian divisions. But along the German lines was the unusual Hermann Goering division, a sort of personal army of the Nazi Luftwaffe commander. It was both an airborne force and an armored panzer group, a potentially formidable opponent. The British airborne forces were assigned to attack along the western coast of the island, while the Americans were to drop along the southern coast. The amphibious forces would fill the gaps around the paras. It would be the largest Allied combined paratroop glider operation to date in the war. It nearly proved to be the last. It was slated to be a nighttime operation. Planes and gliders filled with men and equipment launched into the night sky and over the invasion fleet. The nervous Allied gunners took dim aim and fired on their own. Allied planes fell from the skies. Worse still, many glider tow planes dropped their lines in the confusion, dooming nearly 80 gliders and more than 250 men who were left to crash into the sea. For the men and aircraft that did get through, the nightmare was not over. Winds of 35 miles per hour blew the paratroopers wildly off course. Many scattered so widely as to become ineffectual as fighting units. Individual soldiers did manage heroic acts against the Germans, but the lack of a cohesive assault resulted in many more casualties than necessary. A British brigade had been slated to land by glider to capture a key bridge. Only 83 men out of 2,000 from the airborne force got close enough to press the attack. But that they did, and they won.
We arrived out in North Africa, that is the 2nd Brigade and the Air Landing Brigade and the divisional headquarters. And we came out and accepted, of course, and the 1st Parachute Brigade reinforced, resupplied with all the soldiers that they needed now, and they were, again, the first people to drop on the Primacoli Bridge in Sicily. Unfortunately, it dropped all over the place from Etna. And I believe one airplane went on a 180-degree wrong course and landed in the middle of Africa somewhere. But mostly they did land, and there was, in fact, one company, about a company, that actually captured the bridge and held it. And that was the end of that story. But it showed how it is absolutely essential to land, if not actually on the objective, as close to it as you possibly could. This is the lesson that was completely forgotten and not undertaken at all at Arnhem.
The night after the debacle of the first attack, a second wave of airborne troops was sent in. Unbelievably, these men were also attacked by Allied ships.
The sky lit up like the 4th of July, like the Hudson River. I mean, traces everywhere. You see planes going down. We later learned that the final total was 23 planes into the drink, crashing into Sicily, and there's a record of about 3 planes that actually turned back to North Africa.
Paratroops could at least jump from their crippled planes, but there were more than 300 casualties resulting from the mishap. In spite of these setbacks, the airborne forces that did make it into the fight were able to disrupt German communications and generally harass enemy troops rushing to reinforce beachhead defenses. This was the fog of war at its worst. Ironically, because the airborne force was so widely dispersed, the Germans didn't really know what was happening.
This created confusion in the enemy's mind, because no matter where he looked, he saw, you know, little guys, but he had no idea that this was the sum total, you know, 3 or 4 guys. Then maybe 5 miles away you had 3 or 4 guys. So it added, you know, to the good that this happened, you know. However, it didn't happen, it wasn't good for the poor bastards who got shot down.
At one point, German airborne reinforcements jumped on an airfield in the midst of an Allied jump. Chaos and blood was the order of battle all through the island. Ultimately, the Allies pulled together, and the Germans withdrew. Even as the battle for Sicily was winding down, the Germans proved they were still capable of bold moves. In late July, the Italian dictator Benito Mussolini was removed from office. The embarrassment to Hitler was acute. Mussolini was held in virtual arrest by the Italian government at an alpine mountain resort. Hitler dispatched elite airborne commandos to land in gliders on the hotel lawn. They surprised the Italian guards and swept Mussolini back to temporary safety in Germany. It would be one of the boldest airborne operations of the war. The action was clearly evidence of the utility of airborne troops in hostage rescue. It was still tough going for the paratroopers. For the first time in the European war, the American airborne forces were successfully doing what strategists had hoped for, able to act as shock troops in initial fighting and then settle in as very competent infantrymen. The Sicily campaign had the effect of sorting out American command and control problems. This was sustained warfare, with the Germans fighting increasingly closer to home. Casualties were high, but the Paras were soon back in action. In September 1943, the Allies invaded the Italian mainland. Airborne forces were not planned to be a part of the operation, but the attack at Salerno bogged down in the face of stiff German resistance. In a daring move, Allied paratroops were called directly onto the embattled beaches. The paratroopers had dropped into a cauldron. Big German guns were able to rain fire down on the lightly armed men. The Germans were able to cut the Paras off, but only temporarily. The troopers would not give in.
As it turned out, you know, in my estimation, and many others feel the same way, it was a beautiful, beautiful mission. We had it all our own way. The Germans didn't know where we were, and we knew where they were at all times. So we held them up absolutely, completely for one day. They could not reinforce their beachhead. The defense of the beachhead, that is. Whereas we went down, we blew bridge. We'd see them setting up, you know, an 88 gun position. That night we'd go down there and knock it out. It was beautiful, it really was.
The Americans were able to fuse their lines back together and advance on Naples. On October 1st, the city fell, much to the joy of the inhabitants. The advance through Italy began in earnest. Town after town was liberated. The ensuing winter made tough going for the airborne soldiers. Instead of planes, the Paras used mules for transport. Yet the very versatility of the airborne forces once again proved their worth in battle. Victory was not without a cost. In one of the great and longest battles of the war, the German 1st Parachute Division defended the town and abbey of Monte Cassino. For many weeks, the Germans stubbornly fought off attacks from the Allies. The British, American, Polish Commonwealth troops simply could not break the German line. This tenacious resistance would severely disrupt the Allied drive through central Italy. Massive bombing attacks by Allied aircraft only added to the problems of the ground troops, as the rubble left from the bombardment would hamper movement by tanks and other vehicles. Monte Cassino would have to be won by men moving from wall to wall, rock to rock. The British 2nd Para would remain in Italy throughout the long campaign. For the British, like the Americans, this was a frustrating and bloody experience. As they advanced up the mainland of Italy, they found the German destruction of bridges a major impediment to movement. It was decided to mount a 60-man airborne assault well behind enemy lines. They were dropped by 3 Dakotas in daylight at Torricello. Dummies were dropped along with the men to confuse the Germans as to the real size of the operation. The small British force managed to tie up a German division for weeks. Its presence would have been invaluable at the front. In the Italian hills, the 82nd Airborne linked up with the British 8th Army. This was the last action for the 82nd in Italy. It was time for the final great push on Europe. British and American airborne forces withdrew from battlefronts to go to England and prepare for the invasion of Normandy. One combat team remained in Italy for one final operation, the invasion at the resort town of Anzio. This was fighting reminiscent of the First World War. It was intense and personal combat. In some places, it was literally trench warfare. The veterans of the battle well remember the conditions.
Cold, muddy, miserable, sitting ducks, which is exactly what it was. We had them looking right down our throat at all times. They're sitting up there in the Alban Hills. Could see all our movements and everything else. And we were out on the point. There's a section called Carano. And it was a bulge in our line. We could only have one company up there at a time. And depending upon the action, we relieved them at least every 2 to 3 days. We'd rotate the 3 companies up there until that one push that they wiped out our B company. But we took it the next day. We went back up there again. But it was bloody hell, no matter how you look at it. Absolutely miserable.
While the fighting dragged on in Italy, on the Eastern Front, the Soviets were deploying their airborne forces in huge, near-suicidal 10,000-man jumps against the Germans. These attacks did little to alter the strategic situation. But harassment behind the lines did tie up the Germans. Again, the value of airborne forces in well-planned tactical moves proved valuable. In the early spring of 1944, the Allied airborne forces settled in for a few days of relaxation and many weeks of hard training, preparing for the Normandy invasion. This time would be the high point of airborne power and influence in World War II, and perhaps their greatest moment in history. The coast of Normandy. This is where the invasion of Hitler's Europe would come. Breaching its formidable obstacles would take every resource of the Allies, including their now bloodied and experienced airborne forces. They would be part of the greatest air armada the world had ever seen, some 17,000 men, the veteran American 82nd Airborne and the unbloodied 101st Airborne Division, joined by the British 6th. These men would begin the final move to end the war. In the spring of 1944, thousands of men were in Britain getting ready for their new mission. Thousands of replacements. The jump training was continuous as the glider pilots and troops kept up an urgent pace. Senior officers debated the best way to use their para and glider troops. Some wanted massive drops behind German lines to disrupt German reinforcements. Others wanted the airborne forces used in small commando-style hit-and-run attacks. While debate continued, the airborne troops rested. Then final preparations began in earnest for the invasion. Regardless of their role, it would be a tough assignment. England had truly turned into an armed camp. Airborne forces alone could not carry out a successful invasion of France. It would require thousands of pounds of equipment, thousands of vehicles, and hundreds of thousands of men. While the logistical preparations were key to the battle, the airborne forces had captured the public imagination. Prime Minister Winston Churchill visited an airborne training depot and explained to the forces what their mission was.
The hour of our greatest effort and action is approaching. We march with valiant allies who count on us as we count on them. The flashing eyes of all our soldiers, sailors, and airmen must be fixed upon the enemy on their front. The only homeward road for all of us lies through the arch of victory. The magnificent armies of the United States are here or are pouring in. Our own troops, the best trained and best equipped we have ever had, stand at their side in equal numbers and in true comradeship. And when the signal is given, the whole circle of avenging nations will hurl themselves upon the foe and batter out the life of the cruelest tyranny which has ever sought to bar the progress of mankind.
Meanwhile, the men waited. As the invasion date drew near, they were issued the many pounds of gear they would be required to carry into battle, from life vests to ammunition. Eventually, details of the airborne mission became clear. They would be used in force. Perez would drop to take key towns and crossroads. Glider troops would take bridges to prevent German reinforcements from hitting the beachhead. Detailed mock-ups of the landing areas were studied. The key to using airborne forces was to utilize their ability to focus power on specific German positions. They could not cover the whole landing area. If they were too dispersed, they would fail. The men were issued 2 days' worth of rations. They were expected to be without resupply until the beachhead was secured. It was a daunting prospect. They were given French money. After the long weeks of waiting and drilling, the reality was setting in that their rendezvous with destiny had arrived. They knew for many this would mean a meeting with death. Still, proper preparation would increase the odds of surviving the first few moments after landing, when the paratrooper was most vulnerable. Weapons would be cleaned over and over. No one wanted a jammed rifle. General Eisenhower also visited the men just before departure. Both he and they knew that if something happened to the invasion fleet after the airborne had landed, these men would not survive. It was a time for officers to offer encouragement and even prayers. As rugged as these men were, they would seek solace from all sources. Now, time for deployment. Hundreds of planes would be mobilized to take the troops across the channel. While many of these men had seen combat, many of the pilots had not. This would be their first and often last experience under fire. The airborne forces had to carry massive amounts of equipment with them. Resupply would be difficult, if not impossible, during the opening hours of invasion. Once the troops boarded the planes and gliders, their fate would be entirely in the hands of the Air Force until they landed. This was the mission they had been training for. For the ground crews, the moment was also tense. It would be their skills that would get the men deftly in the air. If a parachute rigger had done a poor job, or a tow line was improperly connected, scores of men would plunge to their deaths before even reaching the battle. Finally, there was nothing left to be said or done, except getting on with the job at hand. The Americans are tasked with securing the immediate rear of the beaches and control of the roads inland. The 82nd will land just to the west of the village of Saint-Mary-Glisse, where the 101st flies just beyond to secure Saint-Marie-du-Mont. The British 6th Airborne Division will secure Caen and protect the southern and eastern flank of the Allied invasion force. But over the channel, all the men can do is sit in the dark, listening to the drone of the engines, each with their own thoughts on the hell that was fast approaching. Few orders are given. The men know what's expected of them. The Pathfinders go in first to make the way for the rest of the paras, but few are in the right position. The main assault would have to go in early, nearly blinded. The inability of the Pathfinders to adequately make the landing zones for the main assault has terrible consequences, with unit cohesion broken. Whether it's the British 6th Airborne wafting in from the north to Caen, or the American 82nd and 101st flying in from the west over the Cotillon Peninsula, the situation is the same. Heavy resistance from the ground and widespread disruptions of the flying formations. The flak kills paratroops before they can even leave their aircraft, but the bulk of the main assault finally drops. The gliders come next. Made out of thin plywood and canvas coverings, they are most at risk in flight.
The gliders were set up to where they could be released. The glider could be released at the glider, but it also could be released from the tow ship. And as they were going into combat, if things got too rough, you would think, going through heavy flak, like so thick sometimes that you could walk on it, that the glider pilot would reach up there, the release was right up in here, could reach up there and hit that release and land so he wouldn't have to go into that. But the spirit or the idea that he was needed so badly on the ground, what he was carrying was so badly needed that he realized that, and he stayed on, even though he could have cut himself loose at any time. He stayed on until he got to the LZ, the landing zone. And the LZ, many times, was so badly defended, or so heavily defended, with so much flak and so much small arms fire and so much other things that would keep you from getting in, like prop wash and heavy aircraft in the area, and you could very easily see why a glider pilot would cut himself loose. But he hung on because they needed what he was carrying. The jeeps, the ammunition. Many gliders flew in loaded with nothing but landmines, and you can imagine one of those landmines being set off by ammunition, flak coming up.
The tethers are loose and the gliders are on their own. Some of the surviving gliders ease themselves into perfect landings. Others burst into flame on landing. Some simply crash into obstacles or each other. The British 6th Airborne gliders have been assigned one of the most important tasks of the invasion. They are to land alongside and secure the bridges along the Caen Canal and the Aisne River. The pilots seek out clear places to land while avoiding enemy gunfire. For once, the forces are not too dispersed, and the gliders come down relatively intact where they were supposed to. They would capture what would later be known as the Pegasus Bridge, named after the pair's insignia. The firefight at the bridge had been brief, and miraculously the Germans had not set any demolitions on the bridge. Holding this position would block German reinforcements from rushing to the beachhead once the amphibious landings had taken place. The Germans would not leave the glidermen in peace, and the whole operation came dangerously close to failure.
We suddenly heard these damn tanks coming, German tanks. And we didn't know, they just started up with a roar, and they seemed as if they were almost on top of us when they started up. And they must have been, because these Germans, a few Germans that were still around that and were still awake when we landed there, they literally just scattered in all directions as we got to that side of the bridge. I mean, we did fire our rifles and we threw some grenades around, but in the main, I mean, the Germans there, they didn't give much of a firefight. They were gone. But what they obviously did was to tell the troops in the adjoining village at Benneville that something horrible was happening on the bridge, and these tanks were started up to come and investigate, and they were literally about 50 yards behind me. I was sort of laying down on this ground, and these damn things suddenly came squealing along, and we thought, oh God, no, tanks, we got nothing to stop them. I mean, we couldn't carry any sort of anti-tank weapon. The only thing we had was a little, one handheld, it was on a bipod, but a little thing that was called a Pierce, and it was projectile infantry anti-tank, it was called. Used to fire a little fat fin-tailed bomb, and its maximum distance was about 50 yards or more. So, you know, if you fired that thing and missed the tank, which you quite often did, because it wasn't accurate anyway, and if you missed the tank and it exploded somewhere else, the tank just turned around and blasted you away. And we were sort of thinking, God, what are we going to do? And I didn't even know we'd found a Piat because there's so much wreckage in the gliders. Some of the stuff that we brought down was totally wrecked in the crash. And Wagger Thornton, who was a sergeant with B Company, who was one of the other platoons that came with us, they'd come across from the other bridge to reinforce our side, and he let these tanks get almost right on top. And he, as Wagger said, and I'm in touch with him still, we still correspond, he said he was frightened to death and he didn't know what to do, but he just aimed this thing and pulled the trigger, and this tank literally blew up. It was quite amazing. It went off with a big bang, and all these yellow and orange and blue and all these colours and all this tracer and stuff started going up in the sky, and there were these guys in the tank jumping out and screaming because they were burning, and the damn thing was brewing up, and we hit it with one shot from this little pier. We never even thought the things would ever stop a tank, but as it happened, I think those were very poor old French tanks. They weren't Panthers. If they'd been the big ones, the Tigers or the Panthers, we'd have had no chance. They'd have run straight through that bridge, and that would have been the end of the lot of us.
Another primary British target is the Merville guns, a concentration of German artillery trained on the invasion beaches that had to be neutralized, lest the Germans wreak devastating fire upon the landings. Colonel John Otway led the assault.
I realized it was going to be a very complicated operation and a very tough one. We were jumping over the Atlantic Wall in order to land outside another fortress. And we were going to drop and move up to the attack at night. So I determined that every single man, from the most senior officer down to the youngest and junior private, must know exactly what he and everybody else was doing. With the use of air photographs and models, I decided to construct a replica of the battery over ground as similar as possible to what we could see on the air photographs. An shell had exploded near the tail of the aircraft because I didn't really jump, I was thrown out of the aircraft, thank goodness, because the decision was taken away from me. There were incendiary bullets coming up at me and actually going through my chute, which was rather disturbing. In fact, I was bloody angry about it, and I've been quoted as being, I think somebody quoted it as, apparently I said it was bloody impertinence or something.
Finally, it was D-Day. Colonel Otway and his men flew to Normandy aboard their Dakotas and immediately faced tremendous enemy fire as they approached their drop zone.
I was absolutely shattered. 100 all ranks out of 700 that we'd taken off with. And we were due to move off according to orders at 2 in the morning. But I hadn't told anybody, but I'd kept a reserve of 15 minutes up my sleeve, so to speak. So I waited those 15 minutes, and another 50 men came in, and that was it. That was all I had, 150 all ranks. And I had 20 Bangalore torpedoes out of 60, one radio set which didn't work, and I later discovered I had no mine detectors, no tapes, and I had one Vickers machine gun out of 6. I had no mortars. In fact, I had really damn all, except a good bunch of men.
The plan was bold. 3 gliders were to land within the confines of the battery as the assault team blew gaps into the wire.
They had no mine detectors and they had no tapes. They'd gone astray. They cut the cattle wire fence and they crawled through on their hands and knees, feeling for the mines and putting them out of action with their hands. They then about turned and sat with their back to the wire and slid along on their bottoms, making paths by dragging their heels through the earth for us to go through, which I think was an extraordinary thing to do, and sheer cold-blooded bravery.
With the planned glider assault having failed, the ground forces attacked.
I had no mortars with which to fire flares to illuminate the battery for the gliders. The first glider circled, he couldn't see anything, and he went off eastwards and landed somewhere between Merville and Coburg. The second glider came over, he also circled, and landed in an orchard a couple of 100 yards behind us on fire. He'd been hit by incendiary bullets from the battery.
I gave the order to go in. I shouted, in fact, get in, get in. And they went in, yelling their heads off.
I was shouting, bastards, 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 and zigzagging down, and the ground was uneven, which might save your life. On my left, I momentarily heard shouts of mines, 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 and explosions.
The first men to go in that hit the apron fence, which is a barbed wire fence made like that, fell down on their face on top of it, and the others used them as a bridge going over, and then they got up and followed them.
We carried on firing, and there was crossfire. It was like running a gauntlet. You were lucky or not lucky. And suddenly, I reached the rear of the gun, and we threw a couple of grenades in there, and the Germans pushed each other out, shouting, Rusky, Rusky, Rusky.
We'd gone in with 150. We came out with 75 on our feet only. The remainder were dead or wounded.
The men of the airborne divisions had found themselves at dawn widely dispersed. Still, they had caused chaos behind the German defenses. Ultimately, the way was open for the main invasion to proceed. The battle for Normandy was indeed joined. For a few hours, all attention was focused on the beaches, where tens of thousands of men were wading ashore. The men of the Airborne had to hold their ground and wait until relieved. For some, it would be a long time coming. The story is the same all up and down the Allied airborne lines. Isolated, brilliantly executed successes in a vast sea of confusion. The spirit, tenacity, and ingenuity ultimately displayed by junior commanders and troops alike eventually would carry most of the necessary objectives for which they were tasked. Few men knew where they were. Unit cohesion was almost non-existent. Most of the paratroopers were in groups of a half dozen to 50 men. In some cases, all officers or all enlisted men. Units of the 82nd Airborne missed their drop zone and landed in the midst of Saint-Mary-Glisse, where the Germans raked the Americans with deadly fire. Eventually, the Airborne would prevail. The sheer ferocity of the fighting was enough to wear an ordinary soldier down. The airborne forces had expected a tough fight and casualties.
We knew that we weren't all coming back, but we didn't know what to expect. We figured that our jump was going to be somewhat similar to the night jumps we had made before. I don't think any of us considered the fact that we were going to be so widely scattered as we were in Normandy. I wasn't. I don't think anyone was. And the first day in Normandy, I ended up with 52 men at the end of the day. At dark on June the 6th, I had 52 men. There was one who was higher ranked than me, Staff Sergeant Ray Hummel. I was second, and we had no officers. We didn't get any equipment bundles because all of us that were there had landed in the river, in the floodwaters of the river. Those who landed in the main stream drowned. I was very fortunate. I landed in the floodwaters, and it was only a little over waist deep. The Germans were shooting at us on the way down. They hit my cantier, my gas mask that was on my side. I had left the gas mask in England and filled it with cigarettes, and they shot holes through that gas mask, and then I landed in the water, so I had no cigarettes. You're not supposed to smoke anyway. But the fellows who were around there, we had men from the 101st Division, we had some from the 505 Regiment, we had some from the 507 Regiment, and a few from our own. But they were all had done the same training that we had, and we had faith in them. They had faith in Ray and I to get them through, and we got most of them through. I think a lot of it was pure luck, but we survived several real severe firefights along the way, and we were behind the lines 5 days. We were finally pinned down in a field in the little town of Bouzeville-la-Bastille, and by that time, our 52 had gone down to 39. We had lost 13 in the firefights. We had 2 wounded with us at that time. We took our wounded with us. If they were able to move at all, we took them. And
We were there in that same field then for 4 days. And the Germans tried from all angles to get us out of there, and they didn't make it. We tried to get out in the dark at night at times, and we couldn't get out. We did go around, one or two of us at a time on a patrol at night and sneak around and find American bodies and get the ammunition from them, and that's kept us going.
As the days wore on after D-Day, the units slowly brought themselves back together. The Airborne reverted to the role as infantry. They would fight on for more than a month. Thousands of men died on both sides of the battle, but the Germans had ultimately lost the advantage. They would now lose the war. But when and how remained a question the men in the fields of Normandy would not worry about. They were too busy trying to stay alive and kill as many Germans as possible. Still, the beachhead was secure. Thousands of men and tons of equipment were brought ashore. The battered men of the airborne forces were finally relieved by fresh replacements. The Airborne would, however, soon be in the front lines again. The men of the airborne forces regrouped. It was time to patch themselves and their units back together. Evaluations of what went right and what went wrong in Normandy were undertaken. Back in London, strategic planners had much to consider. Operation Dragoon, the Allied landings in southern France, was slated for August 1944. Transports and gliders were already in place in newly won bases in Italy. Dragoon was another combined American-British assault. Again, it would be gliders and paratroopers working in tandem. The basic tactics would be the same as in Normandy. The airborne forces would land behind German defenses in order to break up enemy communications and generally cause mayhem. As in Normandy, the gliders had a rough time. They have only a few seconds to find a place to land. Some don't make it. The glider landings in Operation Dragoon once again proved the vulnerability of these fragile aircraft. They had few places to alight, and upon landing, the best the men could hope is that the wings would break off and the glider would stop quickly. In some cases, the aircraft nosed over. The equipment would come crashing through the fuselage, often killing most of the men on board. For those who survived, including the pilots, they quickly have to get out of the glider and begin fighting. The paratroops of the 1st Airborne Task Force took off from some 10 airfields in Italy. About 5,000 men go in the first wave. The men flew what was almost becoming a routine mission. The Douglas C-47 Dakota was by now the standard transport aircraft. It could carry 20 paratroops with their associated gear. One popular feature of the Dakota that made it very useful as a plane for airborne troops was its relatively speedy 200-mile-per-hour cruising speed and its ability to then slow to 85 miles per hour for the paradrome. Even at this reduced speed, it was stable. Its main drawback was that the men jumped from the side rather than a clear jump from the rear. Still, for a civilian transport designed in the early 1930s, the Dakota performed miraculously well. Because of the mountainous terrain over the southern French coast, the men had to drop from more than 1,000 feet rather than the preferred 500-foot altitude. While the target area was around Limoux, some men landed in the midst of Saint-Tropez itself after being blown about in the high altitude. The Allies were lucky. There was limited German resistance. The local German commander had withdrawn the bulk of his forces away from the coast before the invasion. Still, the men couldn't take any chances. They collected themselves and set up defensive positions and joined up with the local resistance. By the end of August, most of France had been liberated. Still, the war was not won. The Germans occupied northern Europe and had massive fortifications along the west wall facing the Allies. A bold stroke to cut into the heart of Germany was devised. Operation Market Garden was the brainchild of Field Marshal Montgomery, hero of El Alamein. That it was a disaster for the British Airborne, and really a wasted effort, was not Montgomery's fault. He was just given too little support for the plan. A small British Airborne Army, in company with the American 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, were to be air-landed in Holland and drive up the Low Country from the south, while the British 1st Airborne Division was to drop on the town of Arnhem from the north. Together, they were to form a pincer movement and link up to hold open a way for the Allies to pour into the industrial Ruhr Valley and the heart of Germany, thus ending the war quickly. The parachute units took off for Holland on the 17th of September 1944. The Americans were tasked with capturing the bridges at Nijmegen, Eindhoven, and other points, with the British taking the crossing in Arnhem. It would be the furthest point from existing Allied lines. The Germans had flooded the lowlands beneath the paratroops. Making precise landings in this morass would be critical if men and equipment were not to be lost in the muck. The glider elements were scheduled to land later and carry the heavy equipment and infantry that would be used in the main part of the operation. Last-minute navigational checks and unit instructions are issued as they await takeoff. These are signalmen tasked with establishing communications once on the ground. The gliders take on their complement of troops, while the tow lines are attached to the Dakota transport tugs. The transports warm in the cold morning air. All the elements of a self-contained army and its supplies are carried aboard the gliders. These men are making their second long trip across the Channel. They now know more of what to expect when they hit the ground. Many of the Americans had never seen combat before D-Day, but few expected the carnage that would result from this battle. The Dutch dikes, opened by the Germans, have flooded behind the seawall, making an overland invasion difficult. Lakes form around the towns of Holland. If the air assault got into trouble, it would be difficult, if not impossible, to rescue these men across the wasteland below. Nearing Eindhoven, the transports release their gliders, which float in for landing. There was little German resistance as the gliders disgorged their contents of men and equipment. They quickly formed up, ready for the advance. The 30th Corps must now traverse 95 kilometers to link up with the element of the 1st Airborne, who at this moment are beginning to land up at Arnhem. They must do that within just 3 days. That's how long the 1st Airborne can consolidate and hold their position at the bridge. There are not enough transports to land all the necessary manpower of the 1st Airborne at once. So the decision had been made to land them in increments, with each consolidating and securing enough perimeter for the rest to land, as the small amount of transports make return trips. But even now, on the second wave, German anti-aircraft guns had found their range, and a number of the transports are shot down. Some of the crew have bailed out. Other elements from later landings pass burning wreckage on their way to link up with landed units. All the bridges in the American Airborne area have been secured. Entering Eindhoven, the British 30th Corps picks up the American Airborne and drives northward toward Nijmegen. They cover the 40 kilometers in 5 hours and reach the outskirts of Nijmegen at 1200 hours on the 19th of September. The important bridge across the Veil River was kept intact by a regiment of the 82nd, who crossed the river in boats to overcome the German defenders. Explosive charges were already in place for the destruction of the span. British sappers removed them. The taking of this bridge was considered an early and important victory. If the bridge had been destroyed, any link-up between Allied forces would have been impossible. But making the bridge safe was a slow and tedious process that took up valuable time. British armor could safely pass over the bridge as the Allies continued the drive to cut around the enemy defenses, guarding northwestern Germany. More supplies and reinforcements winged their way to shore up 30th Corps' drive to Arnhem and relieve the British 1st Airborne, who are now known to be in desperate trouble. Jumping into the danger of Holland required extraordinary bravery. For some, the fear would overtake them.
An officer came up to me and he said, Chaplain, if I freeze in the door, just push me out. I said, forget it, you'll be all right. But he wasn't all right. He did freeze in the door. I had to push him out because the static line was down here, and that means that static line is going to pull your arm off. And so I had to take the static line and bring it up here so I could jump out. That's taking 2 or 3 seconds. And 2 or 3 seconds in jumping out of an airplane is important. I saw him a few hours later or 2 days later, and I said, what troubled you? What was on your mind? You did all right. I wanted to make him feel good. You did all right. And he said, I don't like heights. Oh, I said, what are you in the 82nd for if you don't like heights?
The fear was well-founded. Anti-aircraft fire takes an increasing toll of the transports. Still more troops are ferried in by glider to help widen and firm up the Eindhoven-Nijmegen corridor and to try and establish contact with the encircled 1st Airborne at Arnhem. Despite the fierce enemy opposition on the ground and the dense anti-aircraft fire, comparatively few losses were suffered in the air. Of the 6,000 planes involved in the operation, only 3% were shot down. All in all, the American divisions, despite enduring some hard fighting as they secured objectives in advance of 30th Corps, had the best of the operation. For the British 1st Airborne at Arnhem, the story was quite different.
Every man was dead keen to get into action. We'd been stood up and stood down so many times, and it had become almost a saying that this was a stillborn division, not an airborne division. No, they were dead keen to go. But they hoped, of course, that things would work out better than they did.
The men of the British 1st Airborne had begun their part of Operation Market Garden in the same mood and spirit and at the same time as their American counterparts. Being too far ahead of the heavier infantry and armored units would make linkage difficult between the British at Arnhem and their relief. This would violate a prime airborne dictum not to leave lightly armed men exposed for any period of time. The lack of enough transports saw the paradrops stretched over 4 days. Initially, elements found successes as the Germans had been taken by surprise, but not enough reinforcements could be deployed in time to maintain a viable perimeter surrounding the target. The enemy reeled from the initial assault, but now had time to regroup and counterattack. The British Airborne had endured a difficult battle from the very onset of the operation.
The first thing I was aware of, the next thing I was aware of, was that the port engine was shot out and the starboard engine was on fire on the other side of the aircraft. Half a dozen or more of the chaps were dead as far as I could see on the floor, killed by small arms machine gun fire. And I was a bit worried whether we were all going to get out alive because the plane was going down fairly fast. In fact, I believe it was no more than about 350 to 400 feet from the ground when we eventually bailed out. But it was that or go in with it, of course.
We got action stations down ready to go, and half the drop zone was alight, been called alight. We came down, when we came down, landed, and realised that half the drop zones are fires, of course. We got to our RV, where we were supposed to meet up, obviously, and a tally of men, we should be. So up to that time, we didn't know what the casualties were anyway. They appeared to be light, but we had machine gun fire coming in from the edge of the drop zone. Because what we didn't know at that time, of course, that the Germans had some idea what was happening. They thought, well, come on, they're not going to drop on a brigade here. They're going to drop us. It's going to be a second lift. And they set up in the woods ready for us. So where the first brigade got in quite calmly, jumped down, taken by surprise, they were technically waiting for us because they knew that we were going to come in.
Unbeknownst to the Allies, they had dropped into a nest of 70,000 German troops and several panzer divisions, all of whom now converged on Arnhem. Further drops of 1st Airborne troops were helpless targets for German guns.
On the dropping zone, the divisional headquarters are set up on the edge of the forest, and the brigade that had moved off, the first brigade that moved off, was moving as fast as they possibly could up to the bridge. About after a few hours, the communications started to fail. My commanding officer sent me off to find out what was going wrong.
Well, say, one, we didn't really know what was going on. We only knew what was going on in our little area. And many of my squadrons were getting picked off one at a time. A couple died here. And we still didn't know what was going on, what to do. As I say, no one told us to retreat, no one told us to advance. We were just stuck there. More and more men were getting wounded. And we just didn't know what was happening. We just knew it was happening in our little area. There was odd attempts to go to some other grouping to find out what was going on. They knew as much as we did. Well, we don't know. Except those at the Hartenstein Hotel, which was headquarters. But we just stayed where we were in an area until the Monday night, when we get this order that we're pulling out.
A small detachment did make it to the bridge, but the deadly and sustained fire from the panzers cut deeply into the ranks of paratroops. They didn't have the heavy weapons necessary to stop the German onslaught.
My furthest place that I got to was about half a mile short of the bridge. I found myself with about a few members of a company that had, a number of whom had been killed on the way up. And we occupied a house on the edge of the Rhine. And my orders, of course, were to hold that and then get back as soon as we could. Unfortunately, the ammunition was falling. I think we were down to about 10 rounds a man. And at just about that time, the Germans were attacking like hell and trying to get us out.
The situation had become utterly hopeless. British and American reinforcements were near, but not close enough. The men at Arnhem were barely surviving. A few more hours of fighting would have seen them totally annihilated. The order was issued to withdraw, back across the Rhine. More than 10,000 men had dropped on Arnhem, while just over 2,000 survived. The airborne forces were not used to defeat. Still in war, there are few matches that end in a draw. Arnhem and its bridge too far would at least be remembered for the tenacity of both German and British combatants. In spite of the bitter setback of Holland, through the fall of 1944, German forces on both the eastern and western fronts saw unrelenting defeat. Allied forces entered Germany proper. There was talk of the war being over by Christmas in the British and American camps. The Germans had other plans. By mid-December of 1944, Hitler and the Wehrmacht, by dint of superhuman effort, had managed to form 3 new army groups for a breakout in the West. Its goal was to retake Antwerp and split the Allies in two. The Germans planned to attack through the Ardennes forest, near the encampments of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, resting after the long march through Europe. The whole of the area was very lightly armed, with armor in this sector almost non-existent. On the morning of December 16th, when most of the units were getting ready to celebrate Christmas and an expected early return to the States, 3 German army groups, comprising 8 panzer divisions, smashed into the Allied line. It wasn't until 24 hours later that the Allies knew the strength of the German push and began to actively counter it. The German juggernaut also included 2 Fallschirmjäger, or airborne regiments. Elements of these were night-dropped behind the American lines to sow confusion. General Gavin's 82nd Airborne delayed the German advance from the high ground in front of Saint-Vit and bought valuable time for an Allied regrouping. The 101st, however, found itself trapped and surrounded at Bastogne. The subsequent siege became the most heroic episode of the war. The 101st hung on for days of savage fighting with no chance of immediate reprieve. Its deputy commander, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, went into the history books with his response to the German demand for his surrender. Nuts, he told them, even though his troops were almost out of ammunition and completely out of food and most other supplies, and had nothing with which to counter the Panzer Blitzkrieg, which was set to roll over him. General Patton advanced and engaged in battle to the south, broke off and executed a left turn, driving for Bastogne and the relief of the 101st. He made it just in time, breaking up the German attack after moving around the German 7th Panzer Army. By then, the weather had cleared and Allied pilots could get into the air. Allied reinforcements began to pour in all over the front, and this last German offensive of the war collapsed. By March 1945, Hitler's forces were withdrawing on all fronts. The Allies were unrelenting in driving for victory. But this doesn't mean the Wehrmacht was defeated. The British and Americans reached the Rhine. It is still a formidable obstacle. The assault across the Rhine had to be forced by conventional amphibious movements in order to bring the full strength of the Allied armies across. But the bridgeheads on the eastern bank could still be vulnerable to German attack. Prime Minister Winston Churchill, who first saw combat some 50 years earlier, is on hand to bear witness to this historic moment. Operation Varsity, an airborne assault beyond the beachhead, is ordered to protect the landing. The lessons of Arnhem had been heeded. The airborne force would be within striking distance of the ground forces. It will be one of the largest, and perhaps last, great airborne operations in history. More than 21,000 men on board 700 Dakotas and nearly 500 gliders. The sight of the great air armada impresses even the hardest veteran. Perhaps not entirely by chance, the first man out of the lead plane was Edson Raff, who had led the first American paratroopers to see action in North Africa, a time that must have seemed long ago to the survivors of Tunisia, Sicily, Italy, Normandy, Holland, and now Germany. German defenses were still strong, and many planes were shot down. Some British gliders had the misfortune of landing in the midst of German artillery and anti-aircraft guns. The war was not yet over for these men. The fighting was intense, but ultimately the Germans could not endure a protracted battle. The paratroopers and men of the amphibious assault forces crossing the Rhine would link up in a single day. It had been a nearly classic airborne operation. The war would last for a few more weeks. Many more soldiers and civilians alike would die before Hitler commits suicide below the streets of his embattled capital. Plans for an airborne assault on Norway and Berlin itself would be abandoned. The bitter contest had been won, with the blood of millions forfeited in the course of war. The men of the airborne forces, through triumph and defeat, had borne the brunt of many battles. They were proud of their conquest, but would forever remember their comrades who sacrificed their lives in the quest for victory.